Alright guys, I'm here back with a new video, and in this video, we're back talking about Australian Survivor, Heroes vs. Villains, where we are halfway through the season. So here, I'll be doing my typical mid-season power ranking, where I'll be ranking the remaining players on the season based on how likely I feel like they are to win the game, while also talking about my opinions on the season so far. So let's start off with my general thoughts on the season, which is that it is good. Now, I know there's a lot of talk going around about how this might be the greatest pre-merge ever, and I'm probably not on that level. I do think this was a very good pre-merge, particularly the back half of it. However, I really spent the first couple weeks of the show not really feeling that invested in it. It really wasn't until episode 7, which is obviously the massive Frasier boot, that I feel like the season really started to elevate, and I think the swap has been really fun as well. But for me, I just felt like the first 6 episodes were just all kind of meh. And because that, again, not really sure if this is my favorite pre-merge, but it is certainly a good one. But again, the Frasier boot being an all-time great episode. The Paige boot was really satisfying. The Jordy boot was obviously insane. Obviously, we have these interesting cross-tribal dynamics going on. So again, there is a lot to like about this pre-merge here. I'm definitely liking the season. Again, just probably not as much as what others seem to be. And I will say also, the season's kind of played out very differently from how I was expecting it to be, where I just had the complete wrong read in the pre-season, where I genuinely did think that the vets were not poised to do that great on this season. While I didn't necessarily think it was going to be like a vet pagonging at the beginning of the game, I definitely thought that the vet versus newbie dynamic would be more of a focus and that the newbies would come together, and that simply has not been the case, to the point where we're halfway through the game and almost every single boot has been a newbie, which it's really insane to see this level of these newbies being fodder for these vets, essentially. Though realistically, I think looking back on it, I mean, it is Australian Survivor, and I think I should have expected them to really cater towards the vets. As I do genuinely feel like if we did have a fans versus favorite season in the US at this point, I do feel like the fans would actually genuinely have a shot. However, again, in Australian Survivor, it does feel like this is a cast kind of on the level of what you would expect from an old fans versus favorites cast, to where a lot of the newbies here really don't have much going on. Though thankfully, the vets are obviously incredible TV. I mean, George, all-time great character. Shawnee, all-time great character. Simon has a great arc here. I'm liking Stevie. Even Sean, I thought, has been a fun presence. So, again, thankfully, the vets are there to help salvage this season, but I do feel like the season is mostly playing out in how you would expect a normal fans versus favorite season to play out. But with that, let's talk about the booted players so far, going through them in elimination order. I guess starting off with Jackie, which is obviously just sad to see Jackie have to get medevaced really early on. I mean, obviously complete incompetence of production to think that that was a challenge that wouldn't injure somebody. And for Jackie to also come out of the episode not even getting really any content at all. She gets no confessionals. The only scenes of her talking to George, and it just feels like a really sad way for her to go. And I would like to see Jackie get another chance at some point down the road, as I feel like this could have been a pretty good season for her. Next up, moving on to Anjali, who was fine. I mean, I thought she had a fun energy in her confessional, but obviously we didn't get that much of her, considering she's the first boot. I do think she gets kind of screwed over from the fact that her 2 allies are out of the game for that round, and she's kind of left on her own. Mind you, she did have the opportunity to stop Tribal if she wanted to, and she didn't, so that's bad. But outside of that, I felt like Anjali was a fun presence on the show, but one that seems kind of predictable as an early boot here. Next, I'm moving on to Michael, and wow, I feel like Michael was definitely a surprise to me in how frantic he ends up being on the show here, where again, I didn't feel great about Michael coming into it, but I didn't realize just how much of a focus and how much of a character he was going to be, where he very much reminds me of someone like a David Sampson, and like this really sketchy guy that no one ends up trusting. And based on his extra interviews and everything, he definitely doesn't seem like the most self-aware player in the world, but again, did make for interesting TV at least. Next, I'm moving on to Mimi, who I thought was fine. I mean, I think she played her boot round particularly poorly, and really in the grand scheme of things, I don't know if she's going to be super memorable down the road, though she definitely wasn't like a nothing character on the show. I thought she had some interesting moments. Again, her digging in the cookie jar is funny, and she has like a terrible performance at her final tribal, which is kind of funny. And then also, and again, the fact that the vote flipped at the last second seems kind of nonsensical, as I don't even think it made sense sense for the likes of Shawnee and Liz to flip on her there, but whatever, I guess. Again, I thought Mimi was fine, but someone that's probably not going to stand the test of time. Next up, we got Rogue, and wow, I really did not expect what we got from Rogue. Now, obviously, there was a lot of icky stuff with Rogue, and obviously that's bad. But even beyond that, just gameplay-wise, I think Rogue is possibly the worst player of Survivor I've ever seen. Now, I've openly talked for a while about how I think Wendy Jo was the worst player in Survivor history. However, again, I think Rogue is up there, if not even worse. While she's not the first boot of the season, she is the first boot from her tribe, and she just seems like someone that is so erratic to the point where no one is ever going to want to work with her. Or at least with Wendy Jo, I can kind of see a path for Wendy Jo to be dragged to the end as a goat. Rogue isn't even in that situation. I feel like there's no chance Rogue ever makes it that deep. So again, really terrible player. And even as a character, I feel like I couldn't really enjoy her as much as I wanted to, considering like this icky feeling around her as well. Next up, moving on to Sarah, who I feel like got a really strange edit, where during week 1, they actually took the time to intro her twice, yet then she gets no confessionals in her entire boot week, which was really strange. Like, I feel like Sarah is someone that we don't really know much about her. We don't really know much about what she was thinking in the game. I found that kind of underwhelming, though she did have a couple fun lines here and there, but again, not super memorable presence by the end of it. Next up, moving on to Frasier. And who is Frasier? Again, he obviously had a spectacular downfall, amazing vote-off episode, but also, who is he? And just falls into the trap of being attached to a returning player that will get more content than him, because that, again, didn't really even make the show. Next up, moving on to Shawnee, who was my winner pick, and boy did this disappoint me. I will say, I really did not like Shawnee on the show. I felt like Shawnee really came off really holier than thou, and obviously had this like constant talk about wanting to play the game with honor and loyalty, and it's like, ugh. And coming into it, I really expected her to be more of like a Pia style figure, where I thought she would have a more game savvy nature to her, but it really doesn't feel like that was ever the case. It never felt like she was well positioned on our tribe. It never felt like she even tried to play the game that aggressively. And really, as a whole, I just found Shawnee to be a massive disappointment on this season. Even though out of the newbies, I believe she actually has one of the higher confessional counts, which is kind of funny. Next, moving on to Paige. And I really didn't like Paige on this season. Not even taking into account the out of the game stuff that I also don't like her for. But just within the context of the season, I just found her really grating. And her entire thing of like complaining about how Shawnee threw the challenge was just really ridiculous. And you could just tell how annoying she was around camp. And it's like, again, I did not like Paige on this season. I thought it was really satisfying to see her get idled out of the game. That was fun, but someone I was pretty happy to see eventually go. Next, we got Jordy, who is the first of the vets to be voted out somehow this late into the game. And I mean, Jordy actually surprised me. I will say, Jordy coming into the season, I was not thinking too highly on. I actually thought Jordy was a player that was pretty doomed coming into this season. I thought he would have this massive reputation from the previous season and not be trusted and be almost instantly out of his tribe, or at least be on the bottom. And no, he actually is able to play a similar game to how he played last time, playing this middle very early on. And while obviously he doesn't have the deep run like he did last time, I actually think this was a more refined version of Jordy here. And while obviously, yeah, it's dumb that he doesn't play his idol in his boot round, I can also understand why he doesn't. And I just thought as a whole, Jordy kind of impressed me on the return here, to where I wouldn't be opposed to another chance for him down the road. And next up, we have Ben, who, I mean, ends up being one of the better newbies on this cast, in the sense that he at least got screen time by the end of it. He was at least playing hard-ish. However, I think he played pretty poorly. Now, I do think there were like biases and that sort of thing playing into him being on the bottom of the original Heroes tribe. But even beyond that, once he gets the swap, the fact that he doesn't instantly flip over to the villains is pretty insane to me. Though I will say his downfall is pretty humorous to me, in the fact that he gets taken out in a round where his allies are deemed safe due to this fake cookie idol, an idol that he is the only person in the game that knows is fake. Which again is kind of a humorous storyline to me, but still, at the end of the day, Ben, I feel like, didn't play the greatest in the world, though I did like him as a TV presence, and is someone that I wouldn't be opposed to if he were to ever play again. But with that, we're now caught up to the 13 players left in the game. where I'll be ranking them based on how likely I feel like they are to win the game at this point. And really just in general, I don't have a good sense of who's going to win this season, which is very strange to me with Australian Survivor, where in recent seasons, the last 4 seasons, each of them by this point in the season, I very much knew who was going to win. I felt like it was very apparent based on the editing, just who they were shoving in our faces that was going to eventually win the game. While I feel like this season, there isn't really that. Well, obviously some people are more present than others. It really doesn't feel like anyone's getting this typical Australian Survivor winner edit, which has made this a bit more difficult to put together. Anyway, let's start running through the players. At the bottom, at number 13, the least likely person to win is David. Because who is David? I mean, he literally got his first confessional in this last episode. He's really been a non-factor on the show, which I do think is a shame, as we do see him strategizing at camp, and he seems to be a very solid player based on what we've seen. We've seen him try to pull off a plurality vote. We see him pull together this new majority on the new villains tribe to take out Haley. It's like we see him doing these things. We just hear nothing from him about his personal thoughts on these things. And with him to go almost half the season without getting a single confessional, again, David should be someone that would be looked at as a top contender, but because he has a lack of content here, he's simply not. And because of that, he's here at number 13. At number 12, we're moving on to a player that I've kind of gone up and down on this player over time. I feel like there have been moments where it seemed like maybe there could be an underdog run for this person, and other moments that just fades away. And I feel like at the point that I'm making this video here, I'm not feeling too high on this person. That person is Stevie. Now, in general, I'm actually pleasantly surprised with Stevie on this season. I think he's been a fun presence on their show. The issue is that he's a very inconsistent presence on the show, where it feels like he's only being shown when absolutely necessary. He seems to also just kind of be a follower in the game, someone that doesn't really have much going for him moving forward, where while I can see him making it to the end at this point, I don't think he would win a jury vote unless he was against someone really reviled. Plus also, I mean, the edit's kind of giving him a bit of a dodo edit at points. I mean, the Ben Boot episode was one where they were literally just showing him being kind of an idiot when talking through the vote. And I feel like mixing all these things, it just makes it feel like Stevie is not the eventual winner, which is why he's here at number 12. Now, number 11, we're moving on to essentially someone that's a step above Stevie, has more negativity as a whole, but also just has more content as a whole, and that person is Simon. And Simon's run on this season has been truly insane. I mean, I remember coming into this season, I was expecting Simon to be a strategic force on this season, and instead he's really just getting this massive dodo edit. And especially recently, it feels like they're actively going out of their way to show him in a idiotic light, which I will say I do feel bad for Simon. I mean, well, yes, there are points where he treats George poorly. I mean, George also treats him poorly. And really, you could just tell like how much Simon wants to be here and how much he wants to redeem himself. And now that he knows that that's not going his way, I do genuinely feel bad for him. But again, from an editing standpoint, I do feel like they're really going out of their way to show him in a bad light, which is not the Australian Survivor mold for a winner. However, again, in comparison to Stevie, at least he's on the show more. I mean, Simon is the second most confessional getter of this season. It feels like a lot of this pretty much has been revolving around him and George, and really, again, with Australian Survivor in particular, I feel like that's enough to not put him at the bottom, as at least he's on the show. Now, for all we know, Simon's gonna get this big redemption arc moving forward and be this massive underdog, which, I mean, I doubt it. As really, if anything, like I think Simon's probably primed up to be the merge boot, but either way, Simon definitely has some minor positives to boost him above Stevie, but again, not really above anyone else. So he's here at number 11. Now, number 10, moving on to really a batch of players here all in a row that have not been super present on the show. They've definitely all had very inconsistent edits as a whole, though, again, at least there wasn't as much blatant negativity as there was with the likes of Simon and Stevie. And at number 10, we're starting that off with Flick. And really, Flick's edit to me is one that outside David, I feel like is the least notable of the bunch here. I feel like she is someone that's getting an edit that feels like she's only being shown when absolutely necessary. Again, the only time she's been shown so far are essentially when there was the talk about taking out Haley, and obviously Flick, having been taken out by Haley in the past, would obviously be involved in that. And then now that she's on the bottom on the Heroes tribe and she was handed a fake idol, it's like that's essentially most of her content on this season. I really feel like as a whole, Flick just seems to be such a minor character on the season, especially for a returnee, where there's another returnee that we'll talk about that has very little content, probably less content than Flick, but at least they have a storyline. To me, Flick doesn't even have a storyline for a win here. She's simply just there, and while, again, there is no negativity towards her, which is better than the likes of Simon and Stevie, and she's more present than David, really outside that, there's not really much of substance in her edit, and she's someone I don't think is winning. She's here at number 10. Now, number 9, moving on to a player that probably has more negativity in his edit than Flick, though, is also just a lot more present, and really that negativity doesn't engulf his edit, though still mixed bag of an edit here for Sam. And Sam Webb to me has been kind of a disappointment in the sense that coming into this season, obviously I did not love the casting of Sam, though I remember back in season 1 there was talks about how he would have wanted to play the game differently if he were to ever come back, and he comes back here to just play the same. So again, that's underwhelming. But again, he's been playing a bit harder, a bit more recently, though a lot of that's because he was a secondary target during the majority vote, which I'll say pretty funny. See Sam now in the same position that he openly called Jerry out for back when they voted Jerry out. But again, Sam's edit to me is kind of a mixed bag. Again, like he's present at points, he is getting a somewhat decent edit, but he's never really the focal point of the show. He doesn't really have a solid storyline for a win. I feel like he's another one that doesn't really have much complexity to his edit. So while I could definitely see Sam making a deep run, especially if he gets to the merge, I really don't see an eventual win. But again, he is more present than the likes of Flick and David, which is what excels him here to number 9. Now, number 8, we're moving on to, again, the same tier of people here. Another hero returnee that's gotten a mostly lackluster edit, though there has been a recent spike that has boosted her up quite a bit here. And at number 8, I do have Nina. Now, full disclosure, coming into this week, Nina has been pretty much second to last on my power rankings for a while. However, I did feel like this was a very strong week for her in a way that I can see this leading up to an eventual win. Well, yes, it is bad that she pretty much got almost no content of substance until more recently. I'll say there's a couple positives boosting Nina up here. First, in the fact that she did at least get a confessional in the premiere, where it did set herself up as Sandra's daughter and she's coming back to win, and her more recently getting content that plays off of that, and with her even explicitly saying that she's going to have to play harder from this point forward, like to me this can potentially be a winner at it. It could be a situation of her just not being that important to the storyline for those initial rounds of the game, but now that she is coming to her own, now she's going to be a massive presence in the edit. Now I will say, do I actually think this is going to lead to a win? Not particularly. I think this is probably more similar to someone like a Benji, a Jordy from Blood vs. Water. These edits that were mostly quiet from the beginning, they'll really spike towards the end of the pre-merge, and that leads to a very notable run in the post-merge, but not an eventual win. And I feel like that's probably where we're sitting with Nina, though it is this possibility of a potential winner's edit here that excels her above the likes of Sam and Flick, who I don't have really any confidence in actually winning. So because that, Nina's here at number 8. Now, number 7, we're moving on to a player that has a very similar trajectory to Nina in my eyes, though I thought had a much better premiere, and that person is Matt. And Matt is someone that I was extremely disappointed to see how his edit turned out, where after episode 1, I was thinking he could potentially be this prototypical Australian Survivor winner edit. I thought he had a very solid premiere, being propped up for being a hero and having his tribe talk positively about him. Like, it really felt like maybe he could be the person that is getting set up for eventual win, and then he just ends up being invisible for most of the season afterwards, which obviously continued to sink his chances, though he has had sprinkles of content in the middle, and then more recently has been getting more content now, seemingly being set up as a swing vote come into the merge. So again, like, I think in many ways, like, his story is kind of similar to Nina in the fact that there's at least a semblance of reasons to believe that they could have a winner's edit, while also getting more content more recently. However, for Matt in particular here, I feel like he's at least going to play an important role on this season. I feel like the way that he's been set up here, again, seems to be setting up that he's going to be the main decider at the merge. And I can definitely see him having a solid run afterwards. However, I don't feel like he's actually going to win. To me, he's kind of screaming out someone that's going to fall just short, maybe be in line with someone like a Brett Closer from Survivor Samoa, or maybe like a Jordy, I guess, from last season. Again, this person that has a solid underdog run through the merge phase, but doesn't quite reach the very end. Though, again, there is still potential upside to an eventual win, which is why he's here at number 7. Now, number 6, we're moving on to someone that has, in general, surprised me on this season. Someone that I thought was going to be such a dud coming into this season and be one of the first few boots, but he's getting really close to the merge here and in a position where his edit isn't bad, and that person is Jerry. And again, I really thought Jerry was going to be this very honor-bound, just boring figure on the season, but he actually has ended up playing better than I expected. I mean, again, he flips on the heroes when he recognizes that he's on the bottom. He has gotten himself solidly with George and Shawnee. Like, he seems to actually be playing pretty well. And also, he has an edit that is solid. Now, again, it's not great. It's not to the point where I actually think Jerry is probably going to take this thing. But again, he had a solid premiere. He got an intro talking about his occupation, why that makes him a hero. He continuously got content from Shawnee talking about how much she loves Jerry. And he's also gotten more decent strategic content more recently, with him seeming to be the more strategic mind between him and Stevie, these people on the outskirts of the Spice Girls. Though I will say there's also been some really awkward moments with the heroes where he just tells them to their face that he's on the bottom of them, and that's not great. Though at the same time, the edit didn't really portray that, in that this is bad on Jerry. So again, overall, I actually feel like Jerry's gotten a decent edit. Now again, not really a winning edit by the end of it, but I think at this point, at least still has a chance. So because that for me, he's here at number 6. Now number 5, we're moving on to a player that I will say after this episode in particular, I feel completely out really on this person, though their edit still isn't necessarily bad, even though I really don't see how logically this person ends up winning. And at number 5, we do have Haley. And again, Haley is a very present figure on this season. Despite her not being that integral to much of what's really going on, it seems like she does still have a decent edit. She is pretty present consistently, at least for Australian Survivor standards, though obviously this is not the Haley edit that she got in Brains versus Braun, where there was so apparent that she was going to win from the very beginning. This time it's not necessarily that. I will say episode 1 was actually a pretty good episode for her, but since then it has been a much more mixed bag, and really we get constant talk about how big of a target Haley is, to where I really just do not see how she actually survives all this. And she even seemed poised to even go home in this last episode. Like, I just feel like she has such a target coming into the merge that I'll be mind blown if she does make it past the first few rounds there. But again, from a pure editing standpoint, she is getting a solid enough edit. I mean, I've never had her below 6th place on my power ranking this entire season. She's always been someone in the running. It's just that in reality, I just don't see how it actually happens. And also, if she were to become a 2-time winner, I feel like Australian Survivor really hammed that up. And the fact that she isn't is like major focus in the edit. It does make me think that, yeah, she's probably not winning this. But to me, it's still one of the more likely heroes to win, and because that she's here at number 5. Now, number 4, moving on to a player that has actually been hovering around 1st and 2nd place on my power rankings for a while. However, I feel like more recent episodes have knocked him down a smidge. So at number 4, I do have the last remaining hero on the board. I do have Sean. And again, I will say, I feel like Sean's edit has been much better than I was expecting, where he's gotten a lot of really strong content. Now, he is another one of these people that, like, week 1 was not the greatest, but he did at least get an intro. He was actually the first person to get an intro, so at least that's a positive. But after that, it really feels like he's been getting the edit of this guy that's been running the hero tribe. He's really fitting into the themes of the season, where he talks about how last time he was a hero, this time he's a villain, and he seems to be playing this more cutthroat game. However, I think there's a couple things holding him back now from being at number 1, which he was actually coming into the week for me. First up is his recent edit, in that while it's not bad, it does seem to show Sean being kind of linked up with Haley, and it seems like the likes of a David, a Nina, and Sam are teaming up to go against Shawn down the road, and that's just already a bad sign. But the reality of the situation, the real reason why he's not at number 1 anymore for me, is that I just feel like a villain is winning this season. I do feel like the way this season has been edited, in the way that the villains got such a major highlight early on, all while the Heroes tribe was just simply not as present during the early days. But then also now after the swap, it really just feels like the villains continuously are getting their way. I really do feel like the villains are going to win this season, and because that obviously does knock Sean down. Now again, I still think Sean is the most likely hero to win the game. I do feel like his edit is actually not that dissimilar from a typical Australian Survivor winner edit if you take everything after episode 3 into consideration. Just with the way the season is playing out, I feel like a villain win seems more likely to me at this point, and because that for me, Shawn is here at number 4. At number 3, if you can't tell, the remaining 3 players left on the board are obviously villains, but not just villains, they're all the Spice Girls. Obviously the question here is the order of them. And to be honest, I don't feel super solid on the ordering of these 3 players. I feel like all of them have massive pros and massive knocks to their winning chances. However, we're going to start off at number 3. The least likely Spice Girl to win the game in my eyes is Liz. And straight up, Liz's edit in the last week has been very strong. I really feel like Liz has really been able to come to her own after she's been separated from George and Shawnee. But the issue is exactly that, is that the first 3 weeks of her edit were so attached to George and Shawnee to where they were getting all the content over her. And while that is obviously an inevitability on a returning season that these returning players will get more content than the newbies that they're aligned with, it does make me think that, like, well, wouldn't they be showing Liz if she were to eventually win? Wouldn't you think they would go out of their way to show her? But even beyond that, not just the fact that she hasn't been that present until more recently, but also the fact that she got pretty much nothing in the premiere episode, which is typically extremely damning for someone's winning chances. And while she did get an intro in episode 2, that's still pretty much all of her content for week 1. So again, those are the main negatives for me for Liz. However, I do feel like, again, her recent edit has been very strong. She seems to be very well positioned in the game at this point, where she's obviously just mutinied back to the heroes, to where at that point she does have the majority, where she's back with the Spice Girls, while also they have Jerry and Stevie. They should have a very easy majority there, while also she has these relationships on the other side with David and Sam and Nina. Like, it feels like she's really in the perfect position in this game right now, where also she has an idol in her pocket. Mind you, it's a public idol, and that's kind of an issue, but from a positioning standpoint, she's probably the best positioned in the game right now. But again, her early edit really left a lot to be desired in my eyes, to where while there is this resurgence recently, it's not really enough to keep her above these other 2 more consistent presences, especially when we have this notable trend in Australian Survivor of, again, these Benjis, these Geordies, these people that have very quiet edits early on, but then really spike right before the merge, only to then go out towards the end of the game. Yeah, I feel like Liz could very much be in that mold, so because of that, for me, she's here at number 3. Now, number 2, and again, it's the 2 returning Spice Girl players here, and I really have been fluctuating between these 2, really all season, over which one should be higher, but at number 2, I am going to go with George. And obviously, George is the star of the show. I mean, George has gotten the most confessionals on the season by a decent chunk at this point, and really, he's had this consistent content about his strategic positioning on each of his tribes. He seems to be the most active player on each of his tribes. Like, he is obviously just the central figure of this season, which can be a good and a bad thing. I mean, obviously this could just be a George from Brains vs. Brawn edit in the fact that he gets to the end and doesn't win again, though I think that's very unlikely. I would be very surprised if George gets to the end this time and doesn't win. And also, at the same coin, I could see similarities in his edit to the likes of a David from All Stars, where David was just all over that season in a similar way to how George is all over this one. Though in the same coin, I could also see it being like a Luke, to where he does make a deep run, but is still a massive threat by the end and eventually taken out. Like, really, there are just so many ways that George's edit can play out from this point forward, as I really don't have a solid grasp on what exactly his story is going to end up being, though I do very much feel like he is in it for the long haul. I'll be surprised at this point if he doesn't at least make mid-merge, considering it does feel like we're being set up to him having the numbers coming into the merge. We talk about flipping over Matt, we have Liz and her numbers as well. And while they're obviously setting up this like potential schism between George and Liz, I don't really see that being a real thing for the immediate future. So again, George is someone that I definitely think has longevity. The question is, can he actually pull it off? And to be honest, I think that's really going to be the storyline of the season, where I think by the end, that is going to be the storyline of, can George actually pull this off? Can he actually get to the end? Can he win the game? And again, I think there is a high likelihood of that right now, though I could very much see it just leading up to a story of him falling just short, and because that for me, he is here at number 2. Now number 1, the player I currently think has the best chance at winning the game, and if you haven't deduced it already, at number 1 we do have Shawnee. And Shawnee for me is even here kind of a mixed bag. I think Shawnee had an incredible premiere week. I think her premiere week was very strong. She got the detailer position in the game, got a lot of credit for a lot of the moves happening during that week. And then she had a quiet week too, which can be looked at as bad, though I also don't think it's necessarily bad. As to fair, that's pretty much the exact edit Haley had in Brains vs. Brawn. However, for me, I think the points where I get a little bit worried are episodes like the Frasier boot, where obviously that was a massive episode for the season, and Shawnee was almost nowhere to be seen during that episode. I think that is a knock. And to be honest, that was the lowest point I was on Shawnee. But since then, she's become present again, though in a way that I also kind of question if it's just her being shown when necessary, as it's her being shown when she's finding idols, when she's handing over idols. And again, that is a question mark to me. But to me, in the grand scheme of things, I think her edit's kind of a mix of Liz and George, where I think her positioning in the game is kind of similar-ish to that of a Liz, especially considering I do think it's very likely that Liz and Shawnee are going to work together, more so than Liz and George. But she has the remainder of the edit to back her up as well. Again, she still has that very present week 1 with a lot of setup to her being a major presence moving forward. They're getting the credit for pulling Liz and George into the alliance. She's getting this positive content surrounding her idol plays, and she's being shown as a very savvy strategic player while not being really overexposed in the way that George is. So where, while with George, again, I could see this being this entire storyline of the season to be setting up to George eventually losing, I feel like if that is the case, Shawnee is the most likely person to emerge from that and be the one to take the win from him eventually. While also, again, she got a very strong week 1, and we've consistently seen her thoughts on the changing dynamics on all of her tribes, to where, again, like I do feel like it is a very strong edit here, though again, not to the level of the likes of, again, a Mark, a Haley, a David, a Pia, to the point where I don't feel nearly as confident in this as I did with them. Though the winning trajectory is certainly there for her, and because that she is here at number 1. But there we go, and that's my ranking of every player left from Australian Survivor Heroes versus Villains. Now moving forward, I will obviously be doing a review of the season when the season concludes, along with a player ranking immediately following that. We're also very close to the start of Survivor 44, where I'll be doing similar coverage for that as well, along with Big Brother Canada. We also got the Challenge World Championship starting soon. So again, a lot going on in the near future. So stay tuned for all those things. But for now, that is the video. Thank you for watching.